Hello there, everybody. This is Michael Stern. I have a radio show that broadcasts Friday mornings from 9 to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And one of the highlights of the show, I like to think, is the Tech Talk Tips portion. And it occurred to me today that if I record these videos as well, it'll help you review the material and perhaps be a little bit easier to access than the podcast and going to the show site. So it's all about making it easier for you. I really want to be useful and helpful. So let's get started. This first frame you're looking at is a representation of the scale that's inside your DSLR camera or your point and shoot. The scale could be on the live preview, could be on the bottom of the viewfinder, or on the side of the viewfinder. And the 0, +1, +2, +3, that represents overexposure or adding to the exposure. And -1, -2, -3 stops represents underexposure or subtracting from the exposure. So 0 is the midpoint, sometimes referred to as normal exposure. But it's only normal exposure if you're pointing the meter at something that's a middle value gray. If you review some of the prior podcasts, you'll understand that the meters are designed to push everything into a middle gray value, which is tied to the photographic grayscale. Whether you're shooting in spot metering mode or evaluative or matrix mode or center weighted average or what have you, you point that meter at something, it assumes it's looking at middle gray, and if you're at middle gray, the needle is where it is, that represented by that red line. If you point it at something lighter than middle gray, let's say a bunch of bananas, the needle's going to jump over to the +1. And truly that represents an accurate exposure, because remember, the meters see value, not color. So if you took the color out of some yellow bananas, first of all, you wouldn't want to eat them, but secondly, they'd look light gray, and they'd be about a stop above middle gray, and the meter would reflect it, given this example here. And you don't want to be tempted to change your camera controls, your shutter speed, aperture, or ISO to subtract from the exposure and move that needle down to the midpoint. If you do that, the gray bananas become muddy, dark gray bananas, because we're subtracting from the exposure. If you pointed at a white wall or a white t-shirt, the needle's going to jump up to roughly the +2 position. These are full stop jumps, and in between on this scale are representing, in between are 2 third stop increments. So you know, more or less it's going to be 2 stops. Could be a stop and 2/3, could be two stops and a third, but it's going to be somewhere around there. But this is still reproducible detail. What do we have when the needle is at +3 and in fact goes way beyond? You're probably pointing the camera at the, I don't know, reflection of sunlight in a chrome bumper, or reflection in a glass window, or a windshield of some kind. It's a bright specular highlight, and it would fall at the high end of the scale, because that is the amount of light energy reflecting off the subject. Going the opposite direction, if you have your meter pointed at something that's darker than middle gray, a red apple, let's say, and you took the color out of that red apple, it would be a dark gray, and the needle would be roughly in the -1 position, and that's the correct exposure. Could you change the exposure and change the density and make the apple darker or lighter? Of course you can, Bubba. You can do whatever you want, but we're trying to understand how the scale is working in photography. The frame number 6 out of the 9 we're going to talk about, it's at -2. We're pointing it at somebody wearing a black leather jacket, or a carry case or suitcase luggage that's black. You point the camera at that, and it's going to fall about a -2. Of course, it depends on how black is black, because there's all different kinds. But you get the idea that the needle is going to move up and down the scale depending on what you're pointing it at. And lastly, -3. What's an example of a -3 or a very, very dark? And I'm talking about a black hole. There's no reproducible detail. You're out there hiking with your girlfriend, you're holding hands, you see this face of the cliff, and it's this beautiful gray granite, and there's an opening, it's a cave of some kind. and that would be black without detail. If you put your meter pointed at the granite wall, more than likely it's going to be right around 0 or normal. You point that meter in the hole, it's going to drop all the way down to the left. Now, could you change the exposure and get detail in that black hole? You give enough time or enough intensity on the exposure equation or crank up the ISO, you're going to put density in that area of your photograph. But of course, the values on the outside of the cave, the granite wall, are going to get very, very bright. They're going to blow out, and you're going to lose detail. The scene brightness range, the lighting conditions that you're photographing under exist. And I'm assuming that we're not changing the lighting, that's sunlight or daylight, and we're not supplementing it with HDR or lighting it. When you're faced with the scene, you have to decide, is the scene brightness range within the capacity of the sensor of the camera? Does it fit in the grayscale? Back in the days of film, we manipulated the film, we overexposed the film and underdeveloped the film to extend the range. That's kind of what HDR is doing today with digital capture. But we just want to get an idea of how the needle is moving up and down the scale. This is the first part. Second part coming up.